film, as the rights were bought from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was actually filmed, it would have been a blockbuster. And that's already when the Turkish government, already in the denial, used its ambassador in Washington to pressure the Department of State, which in turn pressured the motion picture producers and distributors of America in Hollywood, and in the end they shelved the whole project. And as I say, that was the policy of suppression. But somehow, there was a revival. On the 50th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide in 1965, there was sort of a worldwide outburst of Armenians, even in what was then called Soviet Armenia, where there was no allowance for discussion of the Armenian Genocide, because that would be considered to be a nationalistic thing, and the Soviet Union didn't like nationalism and because of its relations with Turkey. But it burst out. And at the same time, in the Jewish world, Adolf Eichmann was spirited away by the Israeli Secret Service from Argentina and taken back to Israel for trial and hanging as a Nazi war criminal. These events created a new interest in genocide and Holocaust studies. And so on that basis, only then in the 1960s and the 1970s did we begin to look upon this as a real field. When I started to teach Armenian genocide at UCLA with my wonderful South African colleague Leo Cooper, we had to apply to the university to teach this class, comparative genocide, in the experimental college. It means it was not a part of the regular similarities and differences of genocide and Holocaust. We could typify them from those of terrorization from the period of Genghis Khan to colonialization when we went out to the Americas to destroy the native populations, to, in the case now of the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, 20th century genocides that are characterized by, driven by an ideology, a belief system that makes destruction good. And I'm a farmer boy, so I understand that. When you go out and tell ignorant peasants in the Ottoman Empire that these Armenians are weeds, they're strangling the good, we need to chop the weeds too so that good vines can grow. You understand that, especially when I know that I can have everything that my neighbor has and it's okay. Just a few points more. If we look at the comparative, with all their differences. In the case of the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, the perpetrators were all the more certain that there could be no effective intervention. Because at the time there was neither a home Armenian state nor a home Israeli state. Because already there had been tests, and those tests had not been answered by the world. And I have reference here to massacres of Armenians already 20 years before 1950. Between 100 and 200,000 Armenians were massacred in the Ottoman Empire by the last important Sultan, Abdul Hamid, who was a traditionalist. And for any of you that was alive or have studied the civil rights movement in the United States, you know that when an oppressed group, second-class citizens, as the Armenians were and the Jews were in the Ottoman Empire by law, they had to be second class because they were not true believers and had to pay special taxes, etc. When the oppressed group begins to ask a question a forbidden question, they are troublemakers. When a black person in Selma or anywhere else begins to ask the question that, you know what it is, that small word. And the small word is why. Why am I not equal? Why am I second class? Why do I have, this special thing? For traditional society, such people are dangerous. And if the United States government and army had not intervened in the United States, we would have had probably the same kinds of, maybe not the same degree, but nonetheless much greater degree of bloodbaths by traditional society, as there was in Armenia, when traditional society looked upon these Armenian gavurs, infidels, as going too far, when they asked the question, why? So, massacres of Armenians in 1895-96, massacres of Armenians in 1909, and the world response was condemnation. They condemned it. The world response was to gather relief for the orphans and widows, but no punishment, no responsibility, no calling to task of the perpetrator. So, in 1915, when there's a world war, why do you expect anyone to intervene when they haven't intervened in peacetime? World war, in both cases of the Holocaust and Armenian genocide, gave the moment of opportunity to take the most extreme measure to solve an existing issue, at least as perceived in the mind of the perpetrator. Whether it's the Jewish question, you know there had been a Jewish question. There were various solutions that had been posed to the Jewish question. Immigration, going to Madagascar, various different kinds of ideas were thrown around. But then there comes a point where, hey, we don't need that. Here's a moment, a perfect moment, where we can take the most extreme measures to get rid of this problem once and for all. By destroying the group marked as undesirable. And in the Armenian case, again, well, let me go back there. Those of you who know Jewish history or European history know that during the 1930s and the early Hitler years, there had been absolute increasing disenfranchisement of the Jewish people from universities, from government positions. And in 1938, you know, in November, the attacks upon the synagogues and Jewish businesses in what is known as the Night of the Glass, broken glass, Kristallnacht. And what did the world do? I remember going to these newsreels that preceded the double feature movies. And I still remember on my very young mind, I was 5 or 6 years old, but it made an impression, seeing the bonfires in Berlin and elsewhere of Jewish holy books and other things being thrown onto a bonfire. I remember that. The world condemned it. It was on the newsreel, after all. And they said how terrible it was, but what was the retribution? What was the punishment? What was the response of the world? Except to see, report, condemn, but to do nothing. And so Adolf Hitler could certainly say, hey, you know, this is a game. I've taken over the Sudetenland, taken over part of Czechoslovakia, appeasement. So who's going to do anything now when I am in real war, and where millions of people are involved and hundreds of thousands of people being killed anyway? Who's going to ever notice what I'm doing to the Jews? And in the same case, the Armenians having been massacred in the 1890s, 1909 in Cilicia, the world watching, the world condemning, the world maybe getting some relief supplies but doing nothing about it. And so the Young Turk regime, this new regime that takes power, ultra-nationalist, xenophobic, hatred of the other, Fear of the Christians, fear of losing what was left of their empire that had been melting away generation after generation, losing more and more territory, and coming to the decision that if we're going to survive, we have to survive as a Turkish state, and we have to get rid of all the minorities who will not be absorbed or are unwilling to become absorbed, become what we are. And so the supreme moment of opportunity is presented in World War I by this xenophobic clique, and they can point to triggers of battle losses on the Russian front, the attempt of the Allies to throw Turkey out of the war by landing troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which the 100th anniversary of which is now coming. And talking about the ironies and the pain that denial still creates. This year, the Turkish government, as a part of its denial, has moved the commemoration of this big Gallipoli campaign, where British, Australian, New Zealanders, Canadians, and others who fought in that war will join on the battlefield there to commemorate the great battle of Gallipoli, which has never been commemorated on that day, but they're doing it on April 24th because that is the day on which the Armenians worldwide will commemorate their 100th anniversary. Well, in this little disjointed discussion, I can say there's some light in the tunnel. Not much, but a little. When I started discussing the Armenian genocide in various places, Holocaust museums or elsewhere, it was not unlikely that I would be met by groups of hecklers. It was not unlikely there would be people coming with prepared questions that had been supplied to them by various embassies and governments to put me on the spot. I got used to that. And I kept my cool, and I would respond to that by saying, this is really very sorry, very painful. It's painful because there are so many good Turks who helped, and we've never been able to recognize them. We've never been able to recognize them as Jews recognize the righteous Gentiles because of the state denial and the Iron Curtain that came down. So there was no way of ever having any contact any longer with these people. And by your presence and impolite demeanor, you're only making it more difficult for us to understand and to acknowledge those who were good. And there were, because in the stories or in the interviews that I started at UCLA, when the survivor generation was virtually all gone, the only people that were left were the children of 1915. People who had been 5 years old or 10 years old, some of them young mothers. At that time, the oral history I'm talking about, I just lost my mind. In each of those stories, there was some form of intervention that allowed the person to survive, as there are in others. The light continues to become a little brighter in that at those years, I could not imagine that I could have a Turkish colleague with whom I could sit and conduct a rational discussion. I'm glad to say now, some 30 years later, I just came back from a 5-day conference on the Armenian genocide, the 100th anniversary, in the Sorbonne in Paris, and in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Library of France. And of the 60 presenters, more than 20 were of Turkish origin. 1/3 of the presenters of Turkish origin, all of them adamant and insistent upon the reality of the Armenian genocide, and are able to now investigate areas of the Armenian genocide that we cannot, because we do not have access to the kinds of archives and documents and the skills of reading Ottoman that they have. So they are taking the macro history that my generation was able to, in some ways, establish, the overview, the overarching overview of the Armenian genocide, and are now moving toward microhistory. That is to say, what happened in Diyarbakir, Diyarbakir? Why was the Armenian population of Diyarbakir wiped out? Almost 100%. And the answer, of course, lies in looking at the local organizers, the local officials, those who did this with great relish, those who were actually transferred from other places to conduct the wholesale massacre of Armenians, which the previous governor didn't want to do. And in which some cases, again, denial does not allow us to acknowledge some 7 or 8 Turkish officials, governors, and mayors who were actually killed because they refused to carry out these orders. So we're now down to the property confiscation in Adana, in Aintab, region by region, and that's where we're going now. Both the young Armenian scholars and non-Armenian scholars, and as I say, it was unimaginable that some 20 or 30 years ago I could say that 1/3 of the serious participants in an international Congress on Armenian genocide would be citizens of Turkey, or at least born in Turkey, whatever their ethnic origins might be. So there is perhaps some hope. I have now very pleased that the Shoah Foundation, which I'm now affiliated with in Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, is showing a broadening interest in the Armenian genocide, in Rwanda, in the Nanjing massacres, in Guatemala. Interviews are being gathered there, and I've been asked to help with them, these interviews. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to do this or not, but I think I will. I have a 3-minute clip, very, very short clip, that will tell you the effects of genocide on a survivor who could easily today, well, he's no longer living, but could easily have been like hundreds of thousands of other children his age, babies and little children, could today have been entirely different identities, entirely different religions, entirely devoid of anything of their ethnic background and culture. And you'll see what I mean if we can show this 3-minute clip.
Eventually, I was adopted from an orphanage by an Armenian family, and they gave me the name of Shiraev Sukiasyan. Then here, I am in Australia, which is my 5th country. Still, I don't know what's my name, where I was born, who was my parents. Now, here I am. I am somebody, but I am nobody.
So, I'm somebody, but I'm nobody. And you see his name had been changed to Jalal, as all the little children who were taken in were given new identities, new names, and some of them rescued, but even the Near East Relief, which went out to rescue these Armenian children after World War I, decided that if these children looked like they were happy and didn't want to leave, that they were not going to force them. In the same way, that young brides or women who had been taken into the harems or Turkish households would not be forcibly removed. And they thought this might be an act of charity to believe they had gotten accustomed to their new families. They had born children to their captors, and in that world of 1920s, one could not do what perhaps you could think of doing today, and that is for a young Armenian woman who has been violated, and the object of her violation, or the evidence of her violation, is having one or two little babies. Those women could not return to their families with their babies. That was their murderer's child, and it was the evidence of their shame in a very traditional, religious-bound society. And so those women had to face what some people refer to as Sophie's choices, choicest choices. The choicest choice was, you either abandon your children and return to your people and hope to create a new life with a new person who will have you, or you abandon your people and you stay with your new identity and new people. And throughout each of these, I mean, the horrendousness of genocide is difficult to comprehend. You know, I had a conversation with Elie Wiesel at Chapman University, and I challenged him. I said, you know, Professor Wiesel, you say that the Holocaust is sort of outside of comprehensible history. And I said, you know, I think that you can put it into historical context to understand the mindset of the perpetrator, the Treaty of Versailles, the loss of so much territory, economic crisis. And then I stopped and I corrected myself. And then I thought back of those women that I grew up with in Fresno. They could never comprehend what happened. They didn't understand to the very end what happened to them, why it happened to them. People who had lived traditional, peaceful lives generation after generation. Well, here we are. I frequently like to end a talk and with a quotation by Milan Kundera, who was the exiled Czech intellectual. And it's a nice quotation, and it was the first book that I published, The Armenian Genocide in Perspective, back in the 1980s. He wrote, he was the person who wrote the introduction was Terence Dupre, and he was a French Cajun on the Holocaust Council, and a very good writer who died early, but he reminded me of Milan Kundera by saying that Kundera said something like, great powers would distinguish or extinguish small peoples and people whom they dominate and their cultural foundations. And a part of that was genocide. That people who had suffered genocide could never recover themselves, unless they knew the truth of their suffering, or unless those who perpetrated the crime understood the depth of their crime. In the Armenian case, that has not occurred. And for that reason, generation after generation, for those who still maintain their identity, it becomes even more terrible. I'm here at the end of my life, and for me, 1915 today is far closer to me than it was when I was 15 years old. Because the continuous denial of this, the trauma of it, the inability to knowing the truth of our suffering. You know, sometimes we say these Armenians are stupid, spending all their resources and money trying to get somebody to say, yes, the genocide occurred. Yes, President Obama, you promised when you were candidate Obama, that you would say, yes, when I become president, I will certainly recognize the Armenian genocide. 8 years down the road, he didn't know what kinds of pressures he was going to be subjected to, and he still not do it. And so we say, why do we spend all this? And again, it's this whole essence of having to know the truth of your suffering so that you could go on. And that is the challenge today. And Kundera's final comment was, against great powers and against great force, we struggle as best we can. And a cardinal principle in that struggle is the struggle of memory against forgetting.
Will we take any questions?
I think they're tired.